But taxes are coercive themselves, right? So both strategies basically involve some form of coercive tax-raising power. Okay. So in practice, how does this work? Wesley, what are in practice, how would you go about doing this? What institutions does the government use, say, in the eminent domain example that we gave when we're trying to assemble land? What does the government do in terms of?
Seize land and pay the owners the market value.
Yeah, exactly. So that requires both some external funds to pay people that value and some coercion to seize the land, right?
So, I guess usually it would be like local governments.
Yeah.
So then I think most of that is through like property taxes.
Yeah, so like we'll raise money from people outside that group of people coercively, and then we'll also force these people to sell their land. So usually that uses some combination of the two things, right? The problem is that the reason why you have to coerce people is that they're only paid the fair market value for their land, which might be much less than it's worth to them because maybe they've lived there for generations. This piece of land is really valuable to them, right? And similar institutions exist for other forms of takings, like those debt settlements and corporate acquisitions. When someone wants to buy a company, it's not that every person has to sell them their share. It's just that a majority has to vote to accept the offer. Or in debt settlements, like 75% of the people, or some more complicated system, is used to determine whether the sale takes place. Okay. So a question then arises of how do we how do we determine, given that individuals are not going to have to consent, how we're going to use, or whether we're going to use, a coercive state in order to enforce the sales, right, in order to make this decision, right? In particular, we have to decide whether it's worth building the project at all, right? Some projects might be very costly and give very little value, so we don't want to coerce people to build those, right? And we don't have individuals' consent anymore to make sure that the thing is actually valuable, right? Now, when we dealt with externalities, we talked about ways of getting information from people about whether it's valuable to create something. And what were the ways that we talked about during that lecture for figuring out information about those things? Matt Solomon?
Well, like the contingent valuation surveys.
Yep.
And then like the opposite, like the more expert.
Yep.
Sort of like ways of looking at that.
Yep. And do you remember the third one? We thought there was a problem with contingent valuation surveys, right?
Right. Like voting?
Joe?
The VCG?
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. That's right. So we could have experts assess stuff. We could use some of these sort of crazy surveys, or we could use some fancy mechanism like VCG, right? And these things are sort of used with declining frequency. The most common thing is that experts figure things out. The second most common is that we have one of these ineffective survey type things. And then sometimes, essentially never, there's these fancy mechanisms, right? Now, the question is there any key difference that you see here, Wesley, between this setting and in terms of its informational situation and the externality situation?
Well, I guess the externalities, you might want to like cut them down to like an efficient level.
Mm-hmm.
So it was like a sliding scale, whereas this is
one decision. Yeah, that's right. That's a good point. Another issue, yeah, Joe. Yeah.
Well, we went to the experts in the first one because we thought they would have better to make that
Yeah.
decision. Whereas if it's like land, you kind of want to know like how the people value it.
Yeah, in this sort of situation, it's particularly valuable how much value those individuals put on it. And so we care a lot about their particular things and not just what the experts think, right? And so, but on the other hand, those fancy mechanisms seem kind of weird, and there's lots of problems with them as well. So, and we found that the surveys were like kind of crazy, right? If you asked a bunch of people how valuable was their land and they knew that that would determine whether the land got sold or not, right? They're going to really exaggerate things. Bob, did you have a question?
What about as another mechanism, like local initiatives to like increase sales tax to do some kind of like public good, such as like increase general education or
Yeah, but that also is going to be coercive on some people at least, right?
would that be like some kind of like survey that isn't as effective?
Well, but the thing is you have to, I mean, the question is what do you actually do? Do you survey people on whether they want taxes to go up or not? I mean, you have to vote on it in some form, right? So what you're suggesting, I think, is right, which is that, voting is one way to try to get information from people that's not as weird as the other mechanism and maybe not as problematic, but gets information from people. And so, yeah, I think voting is very commonly used as a way of doing this stuff. So everyone gets some weight, and things get approved if people with a certain weight or over, with total weight that's above some threshold, approve the thing, right? Now, the problem with voting, well, actually, we'll get to that in 1 second. So, so this leaves us to sort of trade off or combine a range of different evils. So, George, what are the benefits and costs of having the experts make the decision?
If it's experts making the decision, then the individual isn't as emphasized, so you don't take into account as much what each person wants.
Yeah, and that might be really important, right? But the benefit of expertise is that, experts have time to really think about the thing, right? They can think through what are the costs and benefits in detail. They don't have as much of an incentive problem usually, so we don't have this issue of getting surveys from them. On the other hand, it leaves out the individual information. Now, Joe, what are the pros and cons of the Vickery-Clark-Groves mechanism?
One of the, I guess the pros is it's more efficient than the other mechanisms. Because it takes into account the effect that your decision has on other people.
Yeah, and it gets you to put in your value, right?
Yeah. And then a disadvantage was, like you said, it's complicated.
Yeah.
And there's potential for collusion.
Yeah, absolutely. In fact, those collusion issues can be very, very extreme and make it totally unattractive to do this. So, in particular, in a Vickery-Clark-Groves mechanism, if any two individuals say they have a very extreme valuation, neither of them individually changes the decision that is made, right? Because if you remove either one of them, we were already going to do the thing in that direction. And that means that nobody ever makes any payments, and therefore no one has an incentive to tell the truth, right? So any two individuals colluding with each other can achieve whatever they want under the Vickery-Clark-Groves mechanism. Okay. How about voting? What are the ups and downs of voting, Jane? Yeah? Yeah. 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 Yeah, so it does incorporate everyone's values in a simple way, and it's not too prone to collusion. In fact, it's pretty robust against collusion, but the biggest problem is it's not very related to efficiency, right? We wanted to build the thing if the sum of everybody's values is above the cost, whereas this will do it if the median person has a value that's above their share of the cost, right? And the median and the mean don't necessarily need to be related to each other, and that can lead to all sorts of problems, like, things that people usually call the tyranny of the majority, when 51% of people get a tiny benefit, and it kills off the other 49%, right? And that's not so great, right? So among the available options, I think given the disaster that is Vickery-Clark-Groves and how sensitive it is to collusion, usually we try to combine options 1 and 3, but given the inefficiency of 3, we try to rely on 1 as much as possible, except when we absolutely need information from people. And what system of government do you think that describes, Jackson? Trying to rely as much as possible on experts, except when we absolutely need input from a large number of people, and then we use voting. exactly, right? So that shows you how economic logic goes exactly in the direction of the system of government that most people around the world have adopted, right? And I have some recent research about what's called quadratic vote buying, which you guys saw a little bit of, which tries to ask whether it's possible to do any better than this. Okay, so let me just wrap up the term. This term, we tried to explore some of the basic trade-offs in economic organization to hopefully provide you guys with a better, more nuanced, less ideological understanding of the trade-offs that our society faces. You probably, before this, heard lots of rhetoric from the left and the right about capitalism versus socialism and government versus non-government. And I hope that this course has helped you break down those things into more specific trade-offs about particular ways that different institutions within society are organized. In particular, one of those trade-offs that we talked about today was sort of internalizing externalities and deciding on providing public goods. And the trade-off there was obviously there's going to be a lot of loss if we don't internalize externalities, if we don't provide public goods. On the other hand, it's really hard to get the necessary information to decide on those things. We have to rely on expertise, which doesn't incorporate information from the public, or on voting, which doesn't do so efficiently, right? In redistribution or providing social insurance, on the one hand, insurance helps reduce the risk that people face, and that's a benefit. On the other hand, it reduces people's incentive to earn more income, which is a cost, right? We also talked about how we could try to regulate industries to try to get more static efficiency, or we could try to give prizes to avoid the costs of patents in raising prices above marginal cost. But there were lots of informational problems in those because the entrepreneurs and the firms might have information that society doesn't have, and therefore it could discourage people from entering industries to create new innovative products, right? We talked about the benefits of competition policy trying to reduce the distortions coming from monopoly, but we talked also about the costs of reducing the economies of scale or people's incentives to innovate, right? And my hope is that this will have led you to realize that there's not just a question of government versus non-government. The question is really, in all these different areas, what is the information like at a quantitative level? How much is it in one area versus the other? How relatively large are these different distortions? And therefore, where on a continuous spectrum do we want to lie in terms of the policies that we choose, right? And by doing this, my hope is to combine in you guys the roles of the expert and the voter. Because the more we're able to do that, the more we're going to be able to solve these social choice problems more effectively, because people will both be able to have the expertise to make good decisions and play their role as a voter incorporating their individual information. I hope going forward from this class, you will have, you'll be able to serve our society better in that role. So thank you guys. It's a pleasure having you. And we'll have a review session on Thursday during this time. And then your exam is a week from today